So at the beginning of the trail, people would often talk about how flat Virginia was. And that even though Georgia starts off kind of hilly and then North Carolina is more so and Tennessee more so still, they would say, just wait till you get to Virginia because it flattens out and you'll just fly through Virginia doing 30-mile days. But that definitely wasn't the case. Virginia starts off with the Virginia Triple Crown being the Tinker Ledges, Dragon's Tooth, and McAfee Knob, which are called the Triple Crown of Virginia. In the middle, there's Grayson Highlands, which is flat on top, but you have to get up top and then come down off of it afterwards. And at the end is the Virginia roller coaster, which is, as it sounds, up and down, up and down, up and down for miles. And it's rocky too.
Yeah, so I guess the next big one is that Pennsylvania is rocky. And I guess, yes, Pennsylvania is rocky, but so is Virginia, so is Maryland, New York, New Jersey. They all have, rocks. And the Pennsylvania rocks were probably some of the best rocks we saw on trail as far as cool trail goes. Places where we could do hands and feet scrambles and cool ledge walks as well. I'm thinking about, I don't even know where it was, somewhere we went along quite a narrow ledge up on the edge of the rock.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, there's rocks all the way along the trail.
And notably, the southern parts of Pennsylvania were rock-free, essentially.
Yeah.
Compared to any of the northern states.
Yeah, thinking about our last day coming down off the presidentials.
Right.
Those rocks.
Those were among the worst.
That was probably one of the worst rocky days we had on trail. Rock hopping down a steep hill.
Yeah, slippery.
For several miles in the rain.
That was not a good experience, really.
Yeah. So I guess the rocks in Pennsylvania don't suck as much as everyone says. There's some cool rocks in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, some of the best rock climbs were right there in Pennsylvania, coming out of some of the towns.
And rock hopping, in the sense of not fun rocks, exist almost the whole way along the trail.
Yeah.
And little segments.
Another thing that you hear about extensively are the Virginia blues. People talk about it because Virginia is about a quarter of the total trail's length, over 500 miles. And the other states prior to that and some of the achievements, like getting through the Smokies and so on, came rapidly. And then Virginia just seems to last so long to some people. And so people talk about the Virginia blues or getting down about the trail in Virginia. It's about the 1 month mark, you're past Damascus, and you're past sort of the honeymoon phase, they call it, of starting a long hike. And so people talk about getting the Virginia blues. But in our experience, Virginia was beautiful. Yeah. It definitely wasn't flat or boring. And that 500 miles went relatively fast. We were healthy.
Finally.
Finally. And so we really went pretty fast through Virginia. Not these big 30-mile day every day kind of things that people were talking about when they're saying Virginia is flat, but it was enjoyable. It was an enjoyable section. Mm-hmm. But then soon after Virginia, you get to sort of the lowlands section of the Appalachian Trail, which actually is pretty flat. So West Virginia through Pennsylvania, Maryland, some of those areas are very, very flat. And that's where the bugs got really bad too. And so if anything gave me what I expected the Virginia blues to feel like, it was more the section after Virginia actually than Virginia itself.
I guess also that section afterwards was really hot.
Right.
Going through New York, I really remember it being really hot. And so we lost a lot of motivation to want to walk during the day because it was just too hot. It was much easier to sit under a bridge and try and hide from the heat than it was to keep walking. So that was, I guess, another thing that brought us down in that section more so than Virginia did.
Right.
A lot of people talk about the Appalachian Trail being a huge party, This is something I heard about originally when I was on the PCT. People saying that the Appalachian Trail was much more social, a lot more hostels and drinking and partying.
I especially read that about the beginning of the trail, like the first month, that people are partying their way to trail days at Damascus, for example. And then that trail days itself was the big kickoff party, and then a lot of people would leave the trail after that, that their goal was to get to Damascus and party. And even now, post trail, I read in the 2020 groups, people getting ready to start, about the expectation that trail days is a giant party, that it's not family friendly or anything like that. And I think that our experience kind of proved that you can have a non-party based hiking experience on the trail.
Yeah, so for trail days, for example, we camped in the churchyard.
But we purposely avoided Tent City, which definitely there was some partying back then. So the option exists to party at trail days, but it seems like the party stays in Tent City.
Pretty well, yeah.
And we spent most of our time near the vendors, near some of the establishments in town and things like this. And my parents even joined us, and I would easily say it's a family-friendly event if you stay out of Tent City.
And I guess also all the way along the trail, we avoided hostels most of the way. Partially because being a couple, getting a hotel room, you don't need the cheapness of being in a hostel to afford accommodation. And then also early on with the norovirus and things, the idea of sharing a bunk room with people didn't appeal. I was saying that there wasn't really many people drinking on trail.
No, and the people that were carrying their own flask or whatever they wanted with them, or if they smoked, they were keeping it to themselves, essentially. And of course, people are kind enough to offer various things to you at various places, but nobody's pushy and the party isn't loud and all over the place like you might be led to believe. So you could really have it, I think, either way that you wanted it, depending on what you seek out. If, in our case, we sought out the solitude more so than the party scene, and we got it. And if you wanted the opposite, you could probably find that too.
Before the trail, I had no real idea of what the whites was going to be like. I'd heard early on in the trail that the whites could be really expensive, or it required a lot of logistics to try and find places to stealth camp, or ways to avoid spending a lot of money, or you'd end up having to spend a lot of money to stay at the huts. But it didn't end up being an expensive experience for us. So in total, I spent $25 and Raiden spent $27 getting through the whites, which included a camping pass, which came with some free food and free soup and things like that. And then one night we slept on the floor at Lake of the Clouds.
In my readings prior to the trail, and you would find this if you read a lot of the popular books, people saying that it costs upwards of $100 a night to stay at the huts. And that is true if you stay in the bunks, but that is by no means the only option. Most of the camping that we did were at official campsites. And the way that works is we went to the first one at the beginning of the White Mountains and paid $10 for a pass. And then that pass made every subsequent campsite that we stayed at cost half price, so $5 per. And it also gave you a free soup, a free meal.
A couple of baked goods as well.
Baked goods, yeah. So it actually turned out to be a pretty good deal to actually go to one of those campsites and get that pass early on.
Yeah.
And then that, had benefits throughout the entire Whites. And in fact, we found that a lot of the huts, several of the huts at least, wouldn't mark that card off. So if we went and got a baked good, using the card, they wouldn't mark it off, they'd just give it to you for free. But because we had the card and we offered the card, they gave it to us. So I think having that gave more benefit than we actually paid for. I would definitely recommend getting one.
I think we ended up each having 3 bowls of soup and, 3 or 4 baked goods on our card. So it took up to the 3rd bowl of soup before somebody actually marked off that we'd had it.
Right. And another way that we ended up getting free food in the Whites was to just kind of hang out until after dinner And we didn't work for stay at any point, though of course that's an option for a select number of people. But we didn't want to do that, and we just kind of hung out. We talked to the staff and so on, and several times we got offered some of the main course and some of the other courses as well if they had extra, just for hanging out and talking to people, basically.
Yeah, so we did that at Zealand Hut. We hung out there from about 4:30 or 5 o'clock through to maybe 6:30, 7 o'clock. And in that time we got a bowl of soup each and as much bread as we could eat. I ate maybe 4 or 5 slices of bread then. And then we just walked a little ways down the trail and found a stealth campsite that night. So that worked out really well for us. The other night that we were in the Whites, we stayed at Lake of the Clouds Hut. And Lake of the Clouds operates a little bit differently because it's just south of Mount Washington. And work for stay is limited the same as always. But because they can't turn you away, and make you walk over Mount Washington in the middle of the night, or if the weather's poor, they let you pay $10 to sleep on the floor of the dining room. And so that's what we did there as well. They also have like a little bunker underneath, but it was cold and drafty, and we went and checked it out thinking that maybe we would like to sleep in the bunker instead of on the dining room floor just for being away from all the people. But as soon as we saw it, we decided that the dining room floor was a perfect place for us to sleep that night.
Yeah. And as cold and windy as it gets up there, I don't think you'd ever really want to sleep in the dungeon, as they call it.
Yeah, well, I think the only people who sleep in the dungeon are people who are hiking with dogs.
Right, which is the option for them.
Yeah.
A lot of people call the AMC the Appalachian Money Club. And you might be led to believe this because their huts do bring in a lot of money from people. But it is possible as a thru hiker to get through the Whites paying relatively little money.
One way to conquer the thru hike is to look at it as just a series of short hikes from town to town to town. And it's an easy way to, you don't have to walk several hundred miles, you just have to walk 60 to get to the next place. Or, as you said, I know there was a moment where we had on trail where you thought, I feel like we're spending so much time in town and we're barely getting any wilderness experience, and so the towns are almost taking away from the trail experience.
Looking at the trail as a town hopping experience could be beneficial if you look at doing the whole 2,000 plus miles as daunting or too much to take in at once or too much to plan for. So it's a way to kind of compartmentalize the sections. But on the other hand, and this was sort of my experience, it's a little bit jarring to be out in the wilderness and then back in town and back and forth as frequently as you are. It kind of removes the immersiveness of being on a long thru hike with going back to society as frequently as you end up doing.
I guess the other thing with being so close to town all of the time is that a lot of the wilderness didn't even feel like wilderness. So we could, be a day out of town but still be able to hear the highway or hear the trains tooting in the night, or, the amount of roads that you cross on the Appalachian Trail I found really, really weird.
It's 1 in every 3 or 4 miles on average.
And even through the 100-mile wilderness, which has a warning sign telling us that we're entering the wildest part of the trail, still had 3 road crossings in 100 miles. Which, especially coming from the PCT or Aotearoa, where you can go 6 or 7 days without reaching a road end, it's quite a different experience. And, each experience is its own. I think that going into the Appalachian Trail, you've got to set your expectations in the right place. Know, that it's a lot of the wilderness is not a wilderness experience, and you're going to maybe have a better time.
Yeah, I think, though, that if you're used to hiking in, say, the Midwest or anywhere on the East Coast, it's still going to be more remote than most of the other places that you may have practiced hiking. I know that was certainly my experience, having hiked all over Ohio and all over Pennsylvania and Kentucky and so on. It's still mostly more remote than those places, though not nearly as remote as you might think prior to hiking the trail.
Really?
Yes.
Wow. It's really weird.
Yeah.
People talk a lot about the green tunnel and how much of a green tunnel the Appalachian Trail is, and that's definitely not a misconception. A lot of the trail is a green tunnel. I made a video kind of putting together all of the views that we saw on trail. And I almost feel like I watched that video and that's just tiny little snippets, sometimes days apart, that get spliced together to give like this idea that there is actually a lot of views on trail when there's not. And when there are views, they're often very repetitive. So you get a viewpoint and you look out and you're looking across at a hillside covered in trees. Potentially the same hillside covered in trees that you saw yesterday. But also, when you do get above the bushline, it's absolutely spectacular.
Right. It makes waiting for the White Mountains that much better.
The White Mountains were awesome. Franconia Ridgeline was probably our favorite day.
Easily.
On the trail.
In terms of views.
Yeah, in terms of views. It was, So those views are there. They're just spread out.
We talked about this several times, about which trail would you hike if you wanted certain kinds of hiking experiences. And I think that we both agree that probably the Appalachian Trail is not the trail to go on if you're looking strictly for long distance views like we're talking. It's beautiful in its own way, but it's beautiful in a way that it can get repetitive. And there's a lot of other aspects of hiking, such as the social experience and being in the deep forest and so on, that it has maybe more than some of the trails out west.